Hello guys, okay, and welcome back. So the next huge moment of tension in the 1960s is the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's arguably the tensest moment in the entire Cold War, as it's the moment where nuclear war was the very closest to happening, the most likely to occur. It's also the moment where the Cold War was in America's backyard for the first time. It's no longer happening far away in Europe or Asia, but it takes place in Cuba, a small island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So, like I said, I've just got a map here to show you. The United States is this country here, the green country. If you look on a big map, you see that Florida, this part of the island, just hangs down a little bit. And Cuba is this orange island here. So you can see just how close Cuba is to America. Problems on Cuba, Cuba turning communist, missiles placed on Cuba, therefore has a serious and very real threat to Florida and mainland America, okay? And that's why Cuba is such a big deal for Kennedy and for America to be concerned about. Now, before we can understand about the crisis in 1962 and what happens with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we need to look at the backdrop and the context. So I have to go all the way back to 1959 and look at the Cuban Revolution itself. Okay, so the backdrop of the Cuban Revolution actually begins in the late 1800s. In 1889, the USA helped Cuba become independent from the Spanish Empire. And I've got a picture here of Cuba and America shaking hands, entitled Two Patriots. You know, this idea of we will help you. Again, there are, kind of connotations here of America, the imperial savior, coming in to save Cuba from, the evil Spanish, giving them their freedom, but it's not really giving them their freedom because this is what happens next. So America have helped Cuba become independent. In the years that follow, American businessmen made huge investments in the country and bought up much of the land and the industry. So Cuba was then kind of owned by lots of American businessmen and very wealthy men from America. Now, in 1933, this man here, his name is Fulgencio Batista Zaldivar, who is known as Batista for short, comes to power and dominates Cuban politics for the next 25 years. He's a dictator, so there aren't any elections, and it very quickly becomes a hugely corrupt system. American investments continue, and the government in Cuba is hugely corrupt. It was undemocratic, and opposition is silenced very quickly. So that's what Cuba's kind of become, this undemocratic, cruel regime led by a corrupt government with this man Batista working alongside the Americans. Now, obviously and understandably, by the 1950s, many Cubans have become very unhappy with this regime. And one of these young Cubans is this man. Now, this is somebody you are likely to have heard of before, and his name is Fidel Castro. He began as a young lawyer, and in 1953, he called for revolution. He was actually the son of quite a wealthy farmer. And when he went to university, he kind of becomes interested in left-wing politics. So for his initial call to revolution, he's imprisoned and he's then forced into exile in Mexico. Batista's government became even more violent and unpopular as this is going on. So Castro and his supporters are currently in Mexico in exile, but they're planning their next move. They want to come back to Cuba and they want to change this system. So in December of 1956, Castro returns to Cuba with 81 supporters, including his brother, Raul, and an Argentinian you also may have heard of called Che Guevara, who goes on to do other things, but is also important in helping Castro in the Cuban Revolution. Now, the group are nicknamed Los Barbudas, the bearded ones. As you can see, they all have these very impressive beards, and that's their nickname, the bearded ones. They launch a 2-year campaign of guerrilla warfare. So remember, guerrilla means using the environment, using tactics known to you, like using the land, using the forest, things like that, rather than using conventional warfare. So very similar to what the Viet Minh did in Vietnam, if you remember, in the Viet Cong. They used two years of guerrilla warfare, and their aim is to overthrow Batista and take power back from American businessmen. It grows and grows and grows in support, and eventually, 1st of January 1959, Batista's regime collapses. Batista fled the country, and the following day, Castro and his supporters enter the capital of Havana and declare a new Cuba. So Castro has declared his new Cuba. Now, during the revolution, Castro avoided references to communism, much like Ho Chi Minh in the first instance during his war with the Japanese. He positions himself as somebody kind of fighting for ordinary Cubans against a corrupt, oppressive regime. So he plays more on nationalism rather than communism. The USA initially showed very little interest in this. After he took power, Castro visited the USA and made speeches across the country, saying he's willing to work with the Americans. Eisenhower refuses to meet him, and Cuba began to cause Washington some concern. Eisenhower freezes all Cuban assets on American soil. Castro begins to completely reorganize Cuba, and this is what starts to worry America. He takes businesses and industry into state ownership. The government completely seized control of many American-owned businesses and land in the country, and they began to control the press. Remember, that's called censorship. They introduced a one-party state. They torture and execute political opponents, and they introduced lots of health reforms, and life improved for many people compared to the Batista years. So this worries America because we have very, very clear communist intentions here, communist facets of communist governments. We have the loss of money, land, and business from American hands, and we have a very good improved quality of life for ordinary people, which would suggest that lots of normal people living in Cuba are going to support this regime. So that becomes much more threatening for America. Okay, so as the US grows more hostile to Castro, he turns to an obvious ally, the USSR. So if I move out the way, we've got Khrushchev and Castro holding hands there. Okay, I'm going to come back. So the USSR begins to provide loans and oil to Cuba, and they supplement money and goods to help Cuba regenerate and grow in terms of the economy and life's living standards for ordinary people. In response to this, the USA declare a trade embargo on Cuba. This bans all trade with the country, and this meant that Cuba is now totally aligned politically and economically with the Soviet Union. Interestingly, an interesting fact for you, this trade embargo is actually the longest lasting single foreign policy in American history. And as of 2018, it's still in force. Some loosening has happened, but this is still going on.